All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Annika Erickson Pearson, and welcome to the Peace Piece, Primers for Peace at COP28. This is a series brought to you by a community of practice that is looking to raise awareness about peace and conflict sensitivity within the COP28 process. I'm really not here to say much other than welcome and that this session is being recorded. Myself and Katie Waters are available if you have any tech questions, but otherwise I'm really pleased to be able to hand over to Claire McAllister from CIPRI, who will kick us off and introduce the session. Claire, the floor is yours. Oh, and you're muted. There we go.
Thanks so much, Annika, and thank you so much to the team that have been helping organize all these things in the background, both at CIPRI and at GPP. My name's Claire McAllister, and I, for the last 3.5 years, have been heading up the Environment of Peace initiative here at Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And I'm delighted to kind of be moderating this webinar today, and great to see so many people joining us. So today we're really here to talk about kind of climate finance in fragile settings. And the genesis of this work or this webinar is that we, CIPRI, together with the COP28 presidency and with the Cairo Center for Conflict Resolution, Peacekeeping and Peacebuilding, convened a workshop in the margins of the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development in May this year to talk about climate action in fragile and conflict-affected states. And we had a morning talking about a number of the barriers, a lot of questions around finance. And one of the key things that really struck me and came out the room really strongly was from a number of people sitting around the tables who really from either the peace building communities or the development communities sort of saying, but some of these barriers aren't new. Like some of these barriers are things that we've been trying to address and kind of manage and grapple with for like 10, 20 years. And while they are difficult, we really don't want climate funds to think that these are novel or challenges where there hasn't already been some tried and tested kind of ways forward. And so today, what I really wanted to do is bring together that perspective of what can climate funds, when thinking specifically about conflict and fragile affected states, learn from both the peace building community and the development community in terms of managing risks, in terms of designing kind of effective programs, and also how can these communities work more closely together to ensure kind of effective climate finance into fragile and conflict settings. And so I'm sure we're going to have way more than an hour's worth of discussion within that topic, but I at least wanted for us to kind of kickstart that discussion here, because climate finance, and particular climate finance in these fragile settings, is going to be a really big issue at COP. It's a kind of one of the key themes that comes out in the Declaration on Climate Relief, Recovery and Peace. And I hope this conversation can be one of many that's thinking about at COP and beyond COP, what can be done in this space. So we have a fantastic panel, and my suggestion is that I introduce each of the speakers as I ask them their first question. So, but I will say just a quick word about the kind of format of the session. So I expect to spend about the next half an hour sort of asking questions to the panelists in turn. And then I would really like to spend the next sort of 20 minutes bringing forward your questions, thoughts that you have. My suggestion is that everyone feels free to kind of put those questions in the chat as we go, and I will try and pick out as many as I can in the 20 minutes. I think that will be most effective in terms of time. If you really want to say something, please kind of raise your hand. I'm happy to kind of pass over the mic if you want to ask a question, but my preference would be for you to put them in the Q&A so we can get through as many questions and I can kind of group things as best possible. So I'm going to kick off. Maybe actually the final thing I would say is one of our panelists, Chris, may or may not be joining us. So if he does appear, then I will make sure to bring him into the conversation. But if he is due to be on a flight from Somalia at the moment, so we're not sure if he's going to be able to join us. So I might begin with you, maybe, Karen, to sort of set a little bit of the context. What are some of the challenges that you kind of are facing effective climate action in fragile and conflict-affected states. And I should maybe say Karen is one of my colleagues here at SIPRI. She's a senior researcher in the Climate Change and Risk Programme, and she specialises in international cooperation and development. And one of your key interests is kind of effectiveness of governance and international finance in particular, in terms of sustainable and equitable use of natural resources. And I know that you are currently wading through an array of data about climate finance flows into fragile settings. So what are some of those challenges, and what are some of the key issues that need to be considered as we move forward?
Yeah, thank you, Claire, for that introduction and that question. To give some background on the challenges, I would like to mention 3 main points. First, in relation to climate finance itself, I assume most of you are aware that the total volumes of international climate finance are still well below the goal of $100 billion per year that was agreed at COP15. But also this 100 billion is, of course, a lot lower than what's actually needed, and the longer it takes to take action, the higher those costs will be. But when it comes to how flows are distributed between fragile and conflict-affected settings and non-fragile conflict-affected settings, what we see in the available data is that there are very high variations in the flows per person per country. Between individual countries. So this is the case both for the fragile and conflict-affected settings and the non-fragile conflict-affected settings. And some countries receive considerably higher flows of climate finance per person in the non-fragile set of countries, but these are largely the smaller island development states, where a small investment with a small population result in very, very high per person flows. But when you consider the other countries, both fragile and non-fragile or conflict sensitive, there is a large variation across the board. There are both fragile and non-fragile countries that get very low per capita flows of climate finance, and some that get considerably higher flows. I think it's also relevant to notice that some of the earlier analysis has been done, and a lot of the discussion focuses on multilateral funds. But it's really important to also consider there are also big bilateral flows, which are for ODA in general, so not climate specific, but all ODA. The bilateral flows are around 3 times as high as the multilateral flows. For climate finance, it's a little bit difficult to say how much higher that is, because not all multilateral development banks and funds record explicitly how much goes to climate. But it's important to keep in mind that not all the climate finance needs to come from multilateral flows, but there's also considerable bilateral flow with different types of access rules to multilateral funds. So, but overall, it shows that climate finance needs to be increased, and it's really important to understand which of both fragile and non-fragile settings have little access to this finance. Which brings me to my second point, that is really important to understand what the barriers are that are faced by especially fragile conflict-affected settings. Available literature and reports from recent years have given some insights in what these barriers are, and these are both on the supply side and the demand side. So on the supply side, what these studies shown is that donors are rather risk averse. They're worried about the safety of their staff working in those areas, but they're also worried about the effectiveness of implementing adaptation actions in those areas where they may be worried that investments in infrastructure, others will be damaged or stolen. There's also quite some examples where projects had to be stopped or were delayed because violence broke out. And even if that is sometimes in areas where the project itself was implemented, but in other areas, project implementers experienced that their counterparts within the national authorities had to divert their attention and their resources and capacity to those areas where the conflict erupted. And so it still led to delays and higher costs for the adaptation projects, even if that was maybe in a different region. So these are some reasons why donors may be a bit reluctant to invest in those areas. Then on the demand side, there's also a low capacity within fragile conflict affected countries within the authorities to meet the requirements of the funding institutions in their applications. And that is not helped by the fact that many different donors have different procedures. So countries applying for funds need to get acquainted with lots of different types of procedures. And some of those application criteria also require to show how much reduction in, for example, climate risk can be achieved through a project using several decades of climate data, which may in those settings not have been monitored systematically over time. So that makes it really difficult to meet those requirements. And then there's also some constraints regarding language, because English is usually the language of those applications, but not always in the countries willing to apply. So there's different barriers there. And it has sometimes been suggested that one way to overcome this would be to invest in increasing the capacity of the applicants, but it may be more efficient to see whether it's possible to better align the application procedures of different donors and to facilitate access to finance for those countries. And then as a third point, I think it's also important to realize that even if some of those barriers would be overcome, it does not automatically mean that all of these investments and increase in climate financial flows to those countries would automatically support reducing conflict risks or moving towards peace. There are lots of examples in which climate adaptation resulted in what's called maladaptation, by when one issue is solved by creating another. And sometimes it means a redistribution of vulnerabilities rather than overall reduction. Sometimes it's just insufficient understanding of how the measure would affect the lives of people. Maybe it would involve relocation of people. So as one example, if a water storage reservoir would be built, this can help to create more reliable water supplies for irrigation, which would of course increase the resilience of those, depending on the farming of irrigated crops. But it may also reduce the natural flow of rivers and the ecosystems of rivers and wetlands, and the people who depend on those resources for maybe fisheries or cattle herding or floodplain agriculture. So this is just one example where if the context is not well understood, a measure that's being implemented with the best of attention may actually increase inequalities and create tensions. And lots of other examples of maladaptation also documented in the Environment of Peace report that Claire already referred to, where this was also an important part of the study. So we also did some research into how different national adaptation plans and adaptation projects refer to these risks of conflict as a result of adaptation. And we noticed that although some do, there's usually not a systematic assessment of how adaptation can influence the social dynamics of a project context. And when conflict is considered, it's usually focused on reducing the risk for project implementation, so the impact of conflict on the project rather than the other way around. So this may, as a result, mean that if the focus is so much on the impact of the conflict on the project, it has often as a result that projects are implemented in relatively secure areas. So in that way, not contributing to conflict reduction or peace building. But also if it's not systematically considered what a project does in conflict dynamics, it can mean, as I showed with the earlier example, that the project can increase inequalities, increase tensions, and we would also miss out on possible opportunities to actually contribute through adaptation to conflict reduction and peace promotion. So thank you. This was my brief overview of some of those challenges faced.
Thank you so much, Karen. And really kind of clear there that there's kind of these three big kind of buckets of challenges. I mean, quantity, access, and then kind of, I guess, quality of the programming that then flows out. And maybe at this point, then I can turn to Diane. So Diane leads the Peacebuilding Fund investments to the Sahel, Northern Africa, and Haiti, and is the climate, peace, and security focal point for the PBSO. And previously then worked in UNDP on political institutions in crisis prevention and recovery. And Diane, I wanted to pick up on some of those points in terms of barriers, in terms of access, and maybe we can come on to barriers in terms of quality. But given that the peace building funds, I guess, raison d'etre is trying to get money into some of these fragile settings where the risks are high and where the risk of violence or projects being disrupted or kind of institutional capacity to access funds is low. What are some of the things that you feel that the climate funds could be learning from the Peace Building Fund in terms of your approach, how you think about risk, and how you think about kind of this point that kind of, I guess, Karen was making about aligning the goals of the fund with the kind of situation in country, as opposed to getting the country to align to a kind of fund in kind of miles away. So yeah, really interested to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks, Karen, for the setting up the ground. Let me just maybe reflect on the Peace Building Fund and just say one word about who we are. So we are the United Nations Organization Financial Instrument of First Resort. We invest in countries to provide fast, flexible, and catalytic funding to sustain peace in countries that are or situations are at risk or affected by violent conflict. So throughout the sustaining peace, before, during, and after. What's been interesting is that over the past 5 years, we have received increased demands from all around the world to respond to the growing challenges of climate, peace, and security. And this represents today a total investment of around $130 million, around 50 projects implemented in 27 different countries. Just last year, we approved new investments at the Benin-Niger border, in Sudan, South Sudan, Cameroon, Guinea-Bissau, Kyrgyzstan, and Mauritania. So just to show also the different settings that we work in. Let me maybe focus on 5 things that we do that could help climate funds to invest more easily in fragile and conflict-affected states. So I think the first one is to ground any program and project on a solid conflict analysis that is inclusive of climate-related security risk. And really then on that basis, define the peace-building vision, the programmatic response, and identify strong, mutually reinforcing peace and climate adaptation mitigation co-benefits. And I think that for me, this really goes beyond just being conflict sensitive, but really focusing on addressing the root causes of conflict and instability. The second is be risk tolerant and be equipped to mitigate such risk. So the risk tolerance is part of our DNA, and our partners and donors trust us because we are committed to a strong risk analysis. For each project, we work with our recipient organization to define what are those risks and what is the mitigation strategy for each of the risks that has been identified. Each project gets a risk marker, and on that basis, we also work on a tranche-based approach to then decide how the funding will go, what are some of the milestones that need to be demonstrated for the project to continue. And I think that these steps facilitate also our programming in volatile contexts. The third point is use a flexible and adaptive programming approach. At the fund, we know and understand that in fragile and conflict-affected states, as Karen was mentioning, things can change very quickly between the moment where a project is being designed to the first months of implementation of a project or later on. So access to the targeted areas can change. Political instability can have an impact on the priorities of the government. Security concerns can affect how we can reach certain areas. Displacement may change the number of targeted beneficiaries. So for us, we have this smooth approach where we can adapt easily and rapidly any of our projects to adapt to changing situations. So what we also do in some projects and some contexts that we identify as highly fragile, we also work at the design stage on scenario building, so we can, within the project design strategy, anticipate how the projects would have to adapt in terms of geographical targeting, beneficiary targeting, but also the level of ambition of the project. We also keep track of the delivery of the project, and we discuss on a regular basis with the recipient organization how to accelerate or fast track progress or to adapt projects if we see that projects are stalling. We also have small PBF secretariats in countries that are eligible to receive funding, and that also helps to be in regular contact with the recipient organization, either on the UN or civil society. A fourth point is around the timeliness and the programs and the timeframes of the program. So PBF investments tend to be around 24 months, maximum 36. And these timeframes are more realistic than projects that are too short to promote any kind of institutional or group behavior change, or too long in fluid political and security environments. The fifth point is around be demand-driven and work on the basis of national ownership. At the fund, we have limited resources, and therefore we need to prioritize the number of countries and the themes that we prioritize for our investments. And we anchor our support where the political will is. I think an interesting example, and I'm happy to see that Paul from UNEP in Haiti is also listening to this call, it's under the leadership of the Haiti Ministry of Environment, PBF anchored its support on the study that was developed with support from Adelphi and the UN to identify the climate, peace, and security risk. And we anchored our PBF support on that basis. And I think it was the right moment. You had political will also in a complicated country that is faced with very different challenges in terms of humanitarian, security, political. But we were still able to identify this national leadership and ownership around this agenda. And I think that this is also nice to be able to anchor on such demand-driven and national ownership approach. And this is also interesting in how we at the fund in the eligible countries, we also have steering committees that then provides also this moment for the government to be involved in the project implementation, but also think around how PBF can also have catalytic effect and then link those investments with broader partnership strategies, for example, with the World Bank or climate adaptation funds. Maybe just to finish here, I just wanted to flag also that the Peacebuilding Support Office is about to launch an impact hub. And I think that this is also going to be a great opportunity to use the hub to look at the impact of peace-building interventions, particularly around climate, peace, and security, and how the hub is going to be, has the potential to contribute to deepen the learning around the impact of climate, peace, and security, and particularly how we do this in fragile and conflict-affected states. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diane. And there was so much in there that I was jotting down in terms of kind of the processes that you go through. And one thing that really struck me was the level of your involvement, both in kind of doing this risk assessment mapping, in terms of doing the scenario buildings, in terms of kind of being there to adapt. And I was just wondering if you could reflect a little bit on the resources that requires, and how, I guess my concern is that at the moment, even though the levels of climate finance are not enough, there's a huge pressure on the climate, particularly the multilateral climate funds, to get money out the door, and maybe not have that kind of, I guess, time, capacity, resources to really get into those approaches, and maybe some reflections on kind of, I guess, cost benefits of that sort of involvement?
No, it's a good question. And just for everybody to realize, we are a super small team. So it's not that there's 100 of us that are working and holding the hands, but it's part of our quality control that we work and support. And we are doing this also with a network. So when we work on those project proposals, we work with UN agencies, funds and programs. We work with civil society representatives, and it's a little bit of a shuttling exercise in terms of working with them to meet the quality standards of the fund. So there is accompaniment, and there's also a broader capacity building approach in terms of how our peace building fund secretariats are also working in country to build the capacity within the recipient organization. So I think, it kind of goes both ways. And I think that in the end, this approach is also how you build national capacity, because in the end, it's how we get the governments and our national counterparts to also have this specific set of lens. So as I said, we're a super small team. So if we can do it, I feel that, the climate funds have much bigger teams also than we do. So if we can do it at our level, our fund is around $250 million per year. So if we can do this kind of accompaniment from such a small team, it's about building the networks in country. And I think that this is maybe what they need to have, and how also we strengthen the linkages between the adaptation community and the peace building community, because we see very often within the Ministry of Environment, it's one community, and then you have the peace building one that is separate with a different institutional anchoring. So how do we also get them to work together?
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that's a reflection that comes in so many ways to the same point, that kind of actually some of this is about within country and within the UN organizations trying to kind of build those linkages. I have other follow-up questions, but I'm going to move on and make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak. So Deji is the Global Green Growth Institute country representative in Burkina Faso. Hi. And you previously were Senior Climate Finance Advisor with Commission for ECOWAS, the African Regional Program Manager on Climate Finance for the Global Center for Adaptation, and also Senior Adaptation Finance Specialist for the African Adaptation Initiative. So you have a huge, I guess, experience, Deji, on kind of looking across different adaptation projects within, but also outside of kind of fragile and conflict affected states. And I really wanted to see if you had some reflections on some of those projects that you've seen being financed, being implemented. What is your experiences of some specific projects of climate finance projects that you've been working on in fragile settings, either good kind of examples or opportunities for them to be better, and any gaps that you see in kind of the current climate finance kind of system, which you think need to be addressed to really come to this point of effective climate action in the more fragile settings.
Thank you very much, Claire. Based on my experience working on climate finance project at national and regional levels, undertaking climate finance project in conflict-affected areas is a challenge in several respects. And to highlight this, I will share with you two concrete examples. One of a project we were developing when I was working with the ECOWAS, the Economic Commission of West African States, and the second one in my current position as GGGI's country representative here in Burkina Faso. When working with ECOWAS, we had to agro-pastoral activities. But to anticipate content that donors, in particular the GCF, because this project was targeting funding from the GCF, And to anticipate the concern that these donors would inevitably raise about insecurity in the so-called three border zone, this led us to rethrow the intervention zone towards less affected regions of these three countries. And for those who are not familiar with the region, what we call the three borders include the Soum and Oudalan provinces in northern Burkina Faso, the Tillabéri region in Niger, of western Niger, and the Gourma region of Mali. And this region, these three borders region, is also known as the Liptako Gourma, and it is the epicenter of terrorist activities currently in the Sahel region. So the major challenge was therefore to circumscribe the intervention zone so as to avoid areas marked with a red flag. Unfortunately, these areas are also the most affected by the impact of climate change and climate vulnerability. But let me share with you another example here in Burkina Faso, where the disastrous consequence of the rising threat from terrorism and extremism is the disruption of the normal functioning of democratic institutions with the arrival of the army in power. This led to changes in government priorities. Securing the territory and fighting terrorism are now the top priorities. But also this led to a deterioration in relations between the government and its bilateral partners, resulting in either a reduction in funding or the introduction of new conditionalities. The result is a drop in the volume of funding available and an increase in the time it takes to complete the procedures. And all this at a time where emergencies are more important than ever. In such context, it is key to build a strong partnership to leverage resources and expertise to develop context-specific solutions. It is the case with the partnership that DGI has initiated with Peace Nexus on integrating conflict sensitivity into our operations, namely through the COICA-funded Building Resilience in the Kaya Dori Axis in Burkina Faso project, but also on addressing proactively the reluctance that donors may have when making funding decisions for project proposals in conflict-affected areas. It is about being innovative for future projects and taking on the risk associated with insecurity or conflict rather than simply excluding certain areas. As early as the design phase of this project, we need now to analyze security risks in the same way as you do for environmental and social risks and demonstrate how you will mitigate them. Because for all climate finance projects, when you are developing your funding proposal, you need to analyze environmental and social risk that could arise from your activity, from your intervention. And you need to demonstrate how you plan to mitigate those risks. In conflict-affected areas also, I think that we should now start also including this dimension. Start anticipating by analyzing risk associated with this conflict and insecurity and demonstrate to the donors how we can mitigate these risks. And to do so, partnership is very important because very often those institutions that are working on project development or operating climate finance projects do not have really experience in managing conflict or peace building. So this is something that we realize here in Burkina Faso is very important, how we can build a partnership with those institutions like Peace Nexus who have this experience so that we can build a very strong project that can get good chance to be funded despite the reluctance of these donors when it comes to security and conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you so much for bringing these really concrete proposals where this is kind of live problems that you are kind of looking at today and some of the ways that you're kind of address it. I guess what I'm kind of interested in is what would you kind of, if you could wave a magic wand or if you could do something to affect that donor reluctance or those processes or, what you were talking about with then there's increased requirements and things take longer. What would, in your view, be a solution going forward, a pathway that could enable, would it be a separate fund which was specifically designed for these questions? Would it be a change in the methodology or the processes of the existing funds? Kind of what, or would it be more support? Like what would you want ideally to change in order to address some of these challenges, not just that you're doing yourselves, but you see from kind of your counterpart, I guess, organizations?
Yeah, I think that one important thing would be first to develop an advocacy towards donors, to try to change that perception, because very often they perceive conflict and insecurity as a scarecrow when it comes to making decision funding. So it is very important also to let them know that conflict sensitivity should be seen not as just as a risk, but also as an additional layer of vulnerability on top of vulnerability to climate change. So there is a need, to try to reach a sort of paradigm change at the level of donors. This is something very important. The second thing that is important, I'm not convinced that it would be very relevant to have a separate fund for conflict-affected areas. But for me, partnership and building synergies is very important. And I gave you the example of what GGI is doing currently with Peace Nexus, so that we pull together our expertise and our resources so that we can build good funding proposal that also address the issue of conflict and insecurity.
Thank you so much. Pia, maybe I can turn to you last but not least. So Pia is a policy officer for the climate peace and security at the German Federal Foreign Office. Very lucky that she's managed to run away from another meeting to be able to join us for this. You focus a lot on climate considerations in crisis prevention, also kind of the role of stabilization and kind of peace responsiveness in climate action. And I just wondered, kind of from your perspective, from the German government's perspective, I mean, we've heard a lot there about kind of some of the challenges in terms of kind of access to finances and kind of donor risk appetite. But what do you think kind of peace building can contribute to kind of climate action, that kind of partnership approach that I guess Deti was talking about, and kind of what the German government's kind of approaches to some of these questions of the intersection between, I guess, climate action and peace building?
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me here and being a part of this discussion. So yeah, Claire, on your question, so from now zooming a bit back on peace building and also crisis prevention and stabilization on this perspective, because it's not only about getting the money to conflict affected and fragile settings, but also the action on the ground, actually. So what can be done to improve the situation, no matter from which angle, basically. And there, one of our approaches is, and we also enshrined this in the German integrated security strategy, just published this summer, that our international crisis prevention, stabilization, peace building, and also humanitarian assistance measures need to consider climate needs. So that we have this angle also incorporated in these approaches. And specifically there, when we're looking at peace building, crisis prevention, stabilization, that's where I'm working in. We take their 3 programming approaches, so integrate climate consideration into our regular stabilization, crisis prevention, and peace building portfolio where it is possible and adequate, and this is also step-by-step approach. Then the second approach is to look into contexts where climate change and environmental issues can actually offer an avenue for dialogue, so kind of taking this kind of action to bring parties together for dialogue and peace building. And then the third approach is to have really a dedicated climate peace and security programming that puts climate peace and security front and center, and that focuses on generating new evidence on how is the interplay between the two, but also conflict and climate, but also what are good practices and good approaches. And yeah, so this is what is important there. And maybe one project, and I see that maybe some of the colleagues who are involved in this project are on the call or are familiar with it. So the Weathering Risk Peace Pillar, which is funding a number of pilot projects conducted by experienced peace-building organizations in regions affected by conflict and climate impacts, and then adding also the climate expertise and putting different organizations together to advance the learnings from each other, to advance the evidence base, and then also to get recommendations from there. Yeah, I'm not sure whether I should also focus on the other side of the coin, on the climate funding. But Claire, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the comments that Diane kind of made was on this point about we need to be a bit flexible with the funding in these scenarios, both in terms of, I guess, a very shifting situation, but also in kind of ensuring that we can kind of move quickly and move effectively. And I just really wondered kind of where that's a criticism which I guess I hear over and over again about all kind of donor funding, is like things come in their blocks and kind of people on the ground can't move money from one pot to another pot because it's allocated to this pot. And that provides kind of, then there's a real frustration, I think, for kind of people who are implementing, to feel that like they don't have the autonomy to kind of flex the funding to the most kind of relevant kind of projects. So maybe you could say a little bit about that project funding flexibility, because I know it's an issue which some donors have frankly said to me off the record, there's just no point in trying to shift it, so don't try. But what do you think that things are moving in that space? And do you think that, I mean, either from a German government approach or from a wider kind of donor approach, do you think there is appetite to look into more flex?
Yeah, the flexibility definitely is an issue, and that is also bound to accountability on where does the money go to have responsibility for the money. So it comes from certain considerations, or it has certain reasons that are then not reflecting the realities on the ground. So you have to reconcile wherever it's possible. And I think there are some aspects really important. So it's learning from experiences. So for example, from the Peacebuilding Fund, what Diane said, or from climate security advisors, from projects being implemented on the ground. So this is important. So taking these learnings on board and trying wherever we can and where it's possible to implement. And then what is very crucial, because in some occasions you also need to stick to your funding lines, but then we have coordination on the ground. So with different stakeholders, with international partners here in the headquarters, to make sure that the different instruments really complement each other and address needs. So this is then, very important aspect. And we have some instruments that are dedicated to actually address, different needs. And maybe this is not directly tied to climate, peace, and security, but we have, for example, all the work going on in the humanitarian peace and development nexus, where because we have these issues also in other areas, that we need to link different kind of activities to have being really effective and successful on the ground. And so that is important. And then maybe some smaller things is where we have projects that are directly funded by us, that we then talk with the implementers, talk with the stakeholders, see where we can then really facilitate matching with other funding, or where kind of is our own wiggle room to adapt the project. So these would be different layers. And of course, we also talk with our climate colleagues to see what are avenues there. And this is, I would say, work in progress. Although I would say that some of the climate instruments have very good safeguards and at least do no harm approaches already in place, or for example, the International Climate Initiative, which is a substantial part of Germany's climate finance, has pretty good safeguard system. Although the focus in general of the initiative is more on the big emitting countries, so it has kind of where the overlap between fragile and conflict affected and the high emission countries is not necessarily there, but we are in dialogue there.
Super, thank you. And I think really interesting to think about how our other initiatives, which are specifically around climate, but are about linking up challenges in different kind of traditionally siloed parts, and providing that kind of more flexible funding, how can they be used, and how can some of those models be kind of looked at as potential for kind of in this space. I can see some questions coming in, which is great. We have about 10 minutes left or so, so if you have a burning question, please put it in the chat. I'm going to pick up on the first two. I also have one, but I'm going to hold my back. The first one that I'm going to pick up on is one that is made about, there's a question which is basically like, at a basic level, how much interaction is there between the kind of GCF, DEF kind of community and the peace building community in terms of peace building funds? How much interaction is there between them? The point made that there's very rarely people from the DCF or the DEF on these kind of calls. And I wondered if I could turn to you maybe there, Diane, and just say, like, do you have any interactions, either formal or informal, between the Peace Building Fund and anyone working at GEF or GCF? And if not, is this something which the PBF is trying to get kind of started?
No, it's a very good question, Claire. And this is on our to-do list because we feel that we as a small fund can help, expand the conversation, particularly around the work that we've been doing in fragile and conflict affected states. This is why we did a thematic review to externally evaluate and document what we've been doing so far and be able to share this globally. And part of our now, to-do list is to reach out and to expand and to basically make those connections. So it's on our to-do list, but as I had said earlier, we are a very small team. So this is on our to-do list. And I think that particularly with COP28, we're looking at having some of those conversations and to see a little bit how we can strengthen those synergies. Also, this is what we are pushing our colleagues in the field to do, because we want to also make those connections between the peace building community in country and the environmental adaptation community, because I think the conversations need to be in country as well. So very often when we work on our project design, we do ask, well, in terms of catalytic effect, how is this linking up to the national adaptation plan, the national adaptation strategy? Have you had conversation, with the ministry in terms of, is our project helping building a pipeline for a climate fund? Is this helping the country to facilitate their accreditation? So we are pushing the reflection at the country level, and then on our side, it's on our outreach and advocacy effort that we want to push forward.
Thank you. No, good to hear. And maybe I should say that part of the reason this is being recorded is that we are very keen to make sure that some of these conversations, even if the people involved in those funds aren't watching now, at least can be shared with the kind of the community that's going to COP afterwards, if they have more time to kind of raise some of these questions. I'm going to go back to Maëlle's question, which is to Karen, and say, are there examples of fragile states that have received significant amount of climate finance? And if yes, what factors have supported this? And I think I can predict the answer might be we need to do some more work to work that out. But Karen, I let you respond.
No, that is indeed my answer. I'm a bit reluctant to say we just have preliminary results to really say, okay, this country gets more, this country gets less. I think I mean, all of these countries get very little. So it's also difficult to say if one gets $1 per person, the other gets 3, it's 3 times as much, but it's still very little. So, but it really seems that the countries that have high per capita values are generally smaller countries, so that a project just, countries with a smaller population, so a similar type of project would just look as a much larger financial flow. So this is probably not the answer you're looking for. In the next couple of weeks, we will analyze these data in a bit more detail, and I can share these results and say a bit more comfortably which are the countries and what the overall picture looks like.
Thanks, Karen. I see that Amanda's just put a link in the chat to say there's a recent evaluation of GCF's work in African states. So maybe that would also help point people to some of this data. There's a question here from Karina, which is kind of, how do the speakers see the peace narrative reflected in the loss and damage discussions? And what can we do to ensure conflict-sensitive implementation? I open the mic if anyone wants to answer that question. I would just point that there was a previous one of these webinars a few weeks ago. I don't know if Annika can put the link in the chat, which specifically talked about kind of how the loss and damage discussions are or are not reflecting some of these questions around conflict and conflict affected and fragile states. So I can, I think that would also be a helpful session, because that was a whole hour on this kind of around this question. But if anyone wants to jump in and unmic and suggest ways in which they think that the loss and damage conversation should be, these kind of questions on climate finance in conflict and fragile states should be reflected in the loss and damage. Let's see if anyone wants to jump in.
I can maybe quickly say a word on that. I would say it's definitely important to keep this discussion going and to follow up on this, because the current stage of setting up the fund and the funding arrangements is way prior to that discussion. So now it's really focusing on where should it be hosted, who is contributing the funding, who will receive the funding. Of course, it needs to be, a very important aspect of this already now, but how it is then actually implemented and how it is set up in detail, we are, it's too early to tell, and the discussions now are anyway really difficult. So that's why I would say it's very important to keep that in mind and always, point to this aspect, but it is not too late to bring this in and make a strong case. But on the other hand, the focus of the fund is not only on that aspect. So we hope that it's set up well from the beginning. Yeah.
Thank you, Pia. Yeah, and I seem to remember there was a representative from the German government at this earlier session that was kind of trying to talk about the need for kind of conflict sensitivity questions within that. I have I wanted to kind of maybe end on a question, maybe for you, Diane, which is about working with non-state actors, and particularly non-state armed actors. Because this is one of these questions that comes up. I mean, I know that some of the big multilateral climate funds they have to work via a national government, like World Bank has to work with a national government. So in countries where potentially the best actors to work with or to get the most effective action would not be the kind of national government, but would be non-state actors, even potentially, how do you work with non-state armed actors? How do we think about some of these kind of questions within the context of climate finance and programming?
Okay, I think that there's no, one approach to this. And I think that for me, it really goes back to you have a strong conflict analysis. As part of your conflict analysis, you have an actors analysis. And within that actors analysis, which we have in a lot of our projects, we do map out what are the roles, influence, positive or negative, or non-state armed groups within the different projects. This is also then factored in our risk matrix and in the mitigation strategy. But I think that you would not, I don't recall seeing any of our projects directly targeting that group as a direct beneficiary. We were much more looking in terms of looking at what could be the impact, positive or negative, they could have. But I don't recall seeing any of them. And then again, we work through governments also as a UN fund. So every single one of our projects that is implemented either by a UN or a civil society organization is signed by the government. So I think that's maybe my answer to that question.
Thank you. We have 3 minutes left, and I want to give everyone on the panel a chance for a kind of 30-second reflection before we close up. So maybe I could start with you, Dechi, in terms of if there's one takeaway you've had from this discussion or that you want the audience to kind of take away, what would the one thing be? And I will come back to everybody.
Thank you very much, Claire. I think that conflict sensitivity is a new reality to be taken into account when undertaking a climate finance project, particularly in the Sahel context. So, but like gender issues or environmental and social safeguarding, we need to take this into account in our operation in the project we are developing and implementing. This is one thing. But on the other hand, I think that also there is a need to develop an advocacy toward donors, so that the issue of insecurity is no longer perceived as just a scarecrow when funding decisions are to be made, but rather as an additional layer of vulnerability.
Thank you. Karen, what about you?
No, I just want to thank the other speakers for the really interesting insights. I think this idea of not seeing conflict areas as something to avoid, but rather to think about how to integrate the consequences of the conflict and on the conflict in study design is really important. And I can imagine there's a lot to be learned by those working in climate adaptation from those working in peace building. So thank you very much for sharing these ideas of what can be learned. And then I think the next step is to actually learn that. Thank you.
Thank you. Pia.
Yeah, I think not only from this discussion, but also from kind of my general work, it is so important to think about the language and the goals that the two different communities have. So the climate community and climate action linked, and peace community and peace action. So they have different goals, speak different languages, come from different angles, but where there is this overlap to bring them meaningfully together and to embrace this moment of learning and then integrating actions. But having this in mind that you just have two different communities or even more maybe, but that there's a big importance to bringing these together.
Great. And Diane, what kind of final reflection from you?
So maybe the final reflection is that we are starting to do that at PBF. So we now have projects, and I was thinking, for example, in Burundi, where we are putting funding within the project design process. We have a partnership strategy that includes public-private partnership plus partnership with CAFI. So looking at some of those climate large funds. So, but it takes time and effort to pool those resources and approaches together, but we are starting to do this. So in Burundi, we've done this. In DRC, in Central America, we have now a couple of new pilots looking at also partnership with the private sector. So we are also deepening our thinking around how can we be catalytic and how we are building this within the project design processes. So this is something that we are doing more of, and we hope we'll be able to share more around that as the projects get implemented and evaluated. So be on the lookout.
Thank you so much. You've been a fantastic panel. I think we've covered so much ground in an hour. I feel if we had another hour, we could cover even more ground, but we do not. Thank you to Annika and the team for at GPP for having set this up. I mean, if I have one takeaway, I have pages of notes, but I have one takeaway is really that point that, like, how do we reach people within these climate funds to start having this face-to-face conversation? How do we make sure that these really rich lessons that we are discussing and thinking about within these spaces are really being shared? And how do we make sure that the energy from COP on the back of the declaration about kind of is really then thinking about how can we start taking some of these lessons and thinking about the need for partnerships, the risk management, the processes by which you can kind of mitigate risk rather than avoid risk, and really to try and get kind of much more flexible and kind of adaptive funding into these settings. So thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this. I hope you guys too. And thanks. Have a nice morning or afternoon, depending on where you are.
Thank you.